decided, in a flash of inspiration, to row across the Atlantic Ocean. Believe me, it seemed like a perfectly logical choice at the time. So I signed up to do the Atlantic rowing race. Actually, part of what inspired this was I read about a couple who were setting out to row across the Atlantic. And I actually met the husband, and he is a big guy. He's 6'5", like 230 pounds, athletic, big, strong. She's about my size and build. They set out from the Canaries, and within 2 weeks, the husband was curled up in the fetal position in the cabin of the boat, shaking with fear, completely incapacitated and unable to carry on. He gets lifted off the boat, and wifey carries on to complete the Atlantic alone. So that gave me the courage. I thought, well, hey, I can row. I rowed for 3 years in Oxford and a few more years in London, so it can't be so different, rowing across the Atlantic, rowing along the Thames. Boy, was I in for a shock. Rowing across the Atlantic was, without a doubt, the hardest thing that I had ever done. Sort of on a par with leaving my husband, actually, because that was really tough too. I picked a really bad year to do it. You remember what happened in 2005 in New Orleans? Yeah, Hurricane Katrina. And it was officially the worst year ever for weather in the Atlantic since records began. So yeah, I know how to pick them. Well, it started off not so well. First sunset, I'm throwing up with seasickness over the side of the boat, and it didn't really improve too much after that. Before I reached halfway, all 4 of my oars had broken in the rough conditions. I had tendinitis in my shoulders, saltwater sores on my bum. My cooking stove had broken, the stereo had broken. The whole thing was just falling apart around me, and I was falling apart too. I was really struggling mentally to cope with this. I'd been so cheery going into it. I'd felt like I was developing these new life skills. It's like, woohoo, it's the new me, I'm setting out in the right direction, the fantasy obituary is coming true, I can do anything with a positive mental attitude. And it just was not like that. It's very hard to maintain a positive mental attitude when you're in pain and your illusions are just shattering one by one all around you. So I just don't know how I hung on in there. These are the bald facts of rowing across the Atlantic. 3,000 miles, 103 days at sea, about 1 million oar strokes, 12 hours of rowing per day. The good news was I lost 30 pounds. But the bad news was that everything broke, and for the last 24 days I had no communications at all when my satellite phone also broke.
Wow. Did anybody know where you were?
They did know where I was because I had a little transponder beacon on my boat that was still pinging back my position via satellite. So my mum could still see the little purple blob on the website that marked me, but I'm sure that in the small hours of the night, she probably wondered if the transponder was still on the boat, if I was still on the boat. Anything could be happening out there. So I'm sorry, Mum, I really put her through it. But she's still more or less speaking to me. But she was probably not that thrilled when, so I'll just skip over these few slides. This is just showing how rough it was on the Atlantic. If you look at the horizon and the angle of the boat to the horizon, I'm sorry, I'm standing right in front of it. And it was like that 24 hours a day. Here we go.
Oh,
Is that better?
That's great.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
24 hours a day, tipping all the time. I learned the hard way that if something isn't tied to the boat or stowed correctly, it vanishes. I was learning a lot as I went along. Broken oars. Even those of you who don't row know that an oar is not supposed to have the big bendy bit. Sore bottom. And bless my heart, yes. So it was a big learning experience, but as they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I did learn so much out there. And probably the most important lesson that I took away from that was that no matter how big the challenge is, you can achieve it if you just take it one stroke at a time. early on in the row, I made the mistake of looking at the whole 3,000 miles that lay ahead of me. Okay, so if I'm going at 2 miles an hour, that's going to take me... And it just sent me into this kind of mental meltdown, tailspin. And I learned the hard way that I had to just focus on the process, whether that was the next day or just the next 3-hour rowing shift or even just the next 100 strokes. After my stereo broke, I did a lot of counting. 1,000 strokes at each hour up to 500 and then count backwards from 500. It's not the most scintillating way to spend your days, but hey, it passes the time. So just take it one stroke at a time. And now when I'm facing a big challenge, like writing a book, I try and just take it one sentence at a time. So having finished the Atlantic and just about survived, and apologised profusely to my mother, the obvious next thing to do was to row across the Pacific. Now, I thought the Atlantic was big, and it is, but the Pacific is really, really big. It was 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. It was about 8,000 miles across the Pacific. If you turn the globe around to that side of the world, you can pretty much only see blue, with a few little dots, including Hawaii in the middle. So I decided it would be relatively sensible to break it into 3 parts. And besides, who in their right mind would row straight past Hawaii without dropping in? The first stop was in Hawaii. The second stop was a place you may not have heard of, Tarawa, which is in the country of Kiribati, which is a teeny weeny little scattering of islands, more or less on the equator, and just the other side of the international date line. And then the third stage, I was aiming for Australia, but then I decided that Madang in Papua New Guinea would be more interesting. Or in fact, the currents took me there, but I decided my idea all along. And unfortunately, my first attempt on the Pacific did not go quite according to plan. You don't need to be able to hear the soundtrack on this, so don't worry about that. This is footage courtesy of the US Coast Guard. And they're telling me just now that what I'm going to need to do, and I'm there on the boat below them looking up at these 20-foot waves, they're going, you have to jump in the water. I'm going, no one told me that about rescues. And this is me. It's a bit hard to spot me. You can see the Coast Guard swimmer quite well. And when he gets a bit closer, if you look between his legs, you'll see little heads down there. And I'd only just met him. So, you know what I said earlier about wanting to be the kind of person who would, in my dream obituary, I would be the kind of person who would go out there and sometimes fail spectacularly. Be careful what you wish for. It was a very public humiliation. It was a tough one. I actually had a title sponsor then who had spent a huge amount of money with a big PR firm to give a really big build-up to this. So I'd been doing loads of media. We've done professional photo shoots. It was all big hoopla. And after a mere 10 days, that's what happened. I just felt completely humiliated. And luckily some very good friends of mine who live on the West Coast in what I think of as the West Coast equivalent of Asheville. There's a little town called Bolinas. Some of you might know it. It's a little surf town in Marin County. Oh, you did?
In Marin County.
Okay. Well, they allowed me to go and stay in their house there and lick my wounds for a couple of weeks because the trolls came out to get me on the internet. People who didn't know that I'd taken out private insurance, so had I wanted rescuing, I would have called out Global Rescue, who would have come and got me. The trolls were going, oh, waste of US taxpayers' money. It was all very upsetting. I was very indignant about it. But really, what can you do apart from develop a thicker skin, dust yourself off, pick yourself up, and try again? And I'm happy to say that the following year, I set out from under the Golden Gate Bridge and made it successfully to Hawaii, a mere 99 days later. And what I learned from that is that when you've got a strong enough motivation to keep going, you can face almost any disappointment, setback, humiliation, indignity, and just keep going. So what was that big motivation for the Pacific? Well, I guess you could say the Atlantic was the internal journey. That was me finding out what I was capable of. And once I found that out, I thought, well, how can I take this inner strength, these resources that I've discovered within myself, and actually use this without wanting to sound too pious. Sorry, I'm a preacher's kid.